Hey, and welcome to another episode. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about neurodivergent leadership and how that presents itself in the workplace. Today, Rita is going to join us and she's going to tell us about all the work that she's been doing with her coaching and her expertise in this subject field. So, Rita, welcome to the episode.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to dig in.
Awesome. So, if you don't mind, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then how you came in to this type of coaching and career?
Sounds great. Yeah. So, Rita Ramakrishnan, I've been in the broader workforce, primarily in the human capital space for the past 15, 16 years. I was most recently, I guess my last corporate job was chief people officer of a technology company. But over the past several years, I've also been building out my own coaching and consulting practice. And executive coaching is very well known as a modality to support leaders to sort of be the best versions of themselves, to accelerate their impact and amplify their potential. But as I dug into the space, the area that I became most curious and passionate about is neurodivergent coaching and how we might support neurodivergent leaders in the workplace. And that's for two reasons. One is I'm neurodivergent myself, and I've had many executive coaches in my past. So thinking about how to support leaders like myself more effectively is something that I've always been passionate about. But there's also just a larger emerging population that is getting diagnosed later in life and realizing that they are neurodivergent and having to make sense of it for themselves.
So, just so we're all on the same page, can you define what neurodivergent is?
Yeah. So I would think about it in terms of how your brain processes information. So neurotypical folks will typically take inputs in from their environment, from conversation, whatever that looks like. They'll process it a specific way and the outputs look a specific way. And historically, what we've accepted to be true is the vast majority of people on this planet process information in a fairly linear way. Neurodivergent folks have brains that naturally process information a little bit differently. We've often pathologized this. I would think about conditions like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, synesthesia. So there are lots of different presentations. So there's HSP, which is, highly sensitive folks and how they process sensory inputs coming in from the environment around them. But however this presents, you're looking at a group of people whose brains naturally process the information just a little bit differently, and how that shows up in terms of their strengths, and how they approach problems and how they engage with people looks oftentimes a little bit different.
Okay, awesome. So when we talk about neurodivergent in the workplace, what does that look like and how does it present itself? So let's say someone's like, I have no idea what this looks like or what you're talking about. How does that look and present in the workplace?
Yeah. So I want to move backwards and think about this. I think a lot of folks can understand this principle a lot more when you're thinking about children. So when we think about schools, ADHD children relative to neurotypical children and how they may show up, you've got the presentation around hyperactivity that tends to be a little bit more common in boys. So how that shows up for them is how they engage with other people, how they engage and operate in a classroom where they get overexcited. There's also the inattentive type, which oftentimes is more present with women who have ADHD and little girls, and how that might show up looks a little bit different in the classroom. So take those principles and apply them to the workplace. These are folks that might respond to conversations a little bit different. They may seem impatient at moments. They may jump ahead very frequently in a conversation, like 3 steps ahead, whereas other folks may be a few steps earlier in that logical pregnant of thought. You might notice moments of significant hyperfocus with them. They'll like get an idea in their head, or they'll have a task that they dig into, and you can't pry them away from that. You might also have moments, whether you have ADHD or you're working with folks who have ADHD, where they don't seem as focused. They're having a really hard time getting their claws into something and digging deep into it. So the way it presents, it looks different in meetings. The way people engage in meetings, how they enjoy the topical conversation and participate in it might look different. I think we're starting to move away also just from language around neurotypical and neurodivergent. I think what we're starting to understand is there's a little bit of a difference in the way we all process information. Whether it's information processing speed or pattern recognition, all of these things sort of exist on various spectrums. And so I do think we're going to be moving more towards the language of cognitive diversity and acknowledging that we all work just a little bit differently. And what that does is it invites a conversation around practices that we have that we've always taken for granted as effective, and moves us to a place where we can debate those a little bit and say, actually, I think I'd be more effective if we changed it this way.
I like that word cognitive diversity more so than neurodivergent. And I heard neurodivergent honestly probably about a year ago, and I had never heard that term before. And I heard it just last year and I was like, oh, well, let me look it up. And I had been looking for someone to talk to about this topic, probably because of my own family history. And I was like, I want to know more about it. And then now you said cognitive, diversity, which I think is even better. So, in your coaching experience, what are the primary things that you're like, you know what, these are the things that we need to focus on?
Yeah. So I'd say the number one thing, oftentimes when folks get diagnosed, and they bring that conversation up in the workplace, the entire conversation focuses on accommodation and tolerance. So these are problems that I have in the workplace as a result of X condition or X form of neurodivergence or the way I process information differently. And they say, okay, what do you need in order to perform? And the biggest shift I would like to see happen, there are absolutely challenges associated with different forms of neurodivergence. I will acknowledge that I have those myself, but there are an extraordinary set of strengths, skill clusters, even, you can think about it that way, that are more prevalent with folks who have cognitive diversity, who are neurodivergent. And what I want to see happen is us move to a conversation around strengths. How might we harness these strengths so that the individual is performing at their best, that they're able to operate in a more natural way, and that not just they benefit from it, their teams benefit from it, but the organization at large benefits from it. We know that bringing diverse perspectives into the workplace is huge in terms of driving competitive advantage for the business. And so when we stop thinking about things as something to be accommodated and start changing that language to how might we harness those strengths? How might we enable you to be the best version of yourself, to operate at your best? I think everyone just benefits. So I think that's something that's really important to me. And that natural component, there's a sense of being at ease. Most folks who are neurodivergent, who have some form of cognitive diversity, they're masters at fitting in.
So let's talk about that a little bit, right? Because I love the fact that you're where you're heading with this was when we're talking about strengths. I absolutely agree 1,000%. Those are huge strengths. So let's talk a little bit about those strengths and then how, that can add to the competitive advantage of a business or an organization.
Yeah. So I would say some of the most prevalent strengths I see with my clients is around information processing. So specifically information processing speed, the ability to widen the aperture in terms of the data you're utilizing to come up with conclusions. So it influences the quality of decision making. I would say creativity and creative problem solving tends to be something that comes up quite often as well. The ability to ask questions that no one else has thought of. So digging into problems differently, and pattern recognition. So folks who are neurodivergent can oftentimes identify patterns that may not naturally come to other folks or may not seem obvious, but they ask the questions around those patterns and they're able to evoke some awareness amongst their peers, amongst the broader organization that can lend itself to higher quality product development, right? Digging in with your customers differently, solving for an obvious problem in new and novel ways. And so these are true strengths that are competitive advantages for the individual and certainly for the organization if they know how to harness it well.
No, absolutely. And I love how you frame that because everything, that I have seen and found, everyone focuses on the negative part, the accommodations piece. And even from like an HR perspective, it was like, okay, well, what accommodations do you need? And I'm looking at it from a human perspective, right? What is it? What conditions do you perform best in? And that's something I would ask of anybody. So for this type, especially when we talk about sensitive people, like lights, sounds, and stuff like that, how can we start to think about that differently from an organization or a leadership standpoint to really help people perform better?
That's a great question. I would say let's just start by acknowledging the spaces in which you operate have a significant influence in how you perform in those spaces, right? Throw me or some of my clients into a room that's super busy, lots of colors, too much art, lots of noise, and it's going to be really hard for us to focus. The kinds of tools that we would need in order to focus and think with clarity is going to be a bit more challenging. And so even as you're bringing new joiners in, as you're walking them around in orientation, checking in with them and just saying, hey, how are you enjoying this space? I'm curious, what are, when you think about when you're at your best, what do those spaces look like? Where have you performed your best? I would say when we think about office design, right? Like part of designing a workforce for the future is identifying the spaces in which you operate, whether that's hybrid, remote, or whatever, and saying, how might we support you as an organization? And I think this is a really important framework for HR teams as well. Being an HR practitioner myself, is asking the question, which is, how do we support you to operate at your very best? And if that means we have more neutral colors or we have designated quiet spaces, we make sure that it's okay. You have flexibility in your schedule. If you need to take a beat, go for a walk in the middle of the day, do what you got to do. Do you need noise canceling headphones? Like that's a very low cost way to support all types of neurodivergence, all types of cognitive diversity and environmental processing in the workplace as well. So thinking about that neutral space and small changes you can make and just asking people questions, operating from a place of curiosity and seeking to understand is probably the best first step.
That's great. It's so when I think about this as well, I also think about it from a standpoint of oftentimes people may not equate people with neurodivergency as being executives and as being leaders.
Yeah.
And I want to dispel that myth because I know that it's all over the place, high achievers everywhere. And in your coaching, what are some tools and techniques? Because sometimes maybe someone's like, hey, you know what? Like I just found out like I've got ADHD or I've got ADD or I have this. And I've noticed that I struggle with X, Y, and Z. What are like the top three things that you notice that people need help with? And what's something that somebody can implement today to help
Yeah.
solve that problem?
So I would say top three things to think about. All of my clients, I work with them to develop what I call the MVR, which is your minimum viable routine. And so that is think about your day and the things that absolutely need to happen. So for folks who have ADHD, sometimes, you need a little bit of unpredictability and space to move around and be flexible with how you spend your time. But there are some basic things that you need to have met. And so identifying those conditions that need to be met that you absolutely can't forget, no matter what type of mood or headspace you're in, and then creating support structures around that. So I'll give you an example, which is most of my clients will talk like vigorous exercise is actually a very helpful tool for people to self-regulate, for you to help regulate your dopamine in your brain and, start operating with a little bit more intention throughout the day. So we sort of talk about what does exercise look like for you in a way that's inclusive for your body and the way in which you move. And we think about how to plug that in throughout the week. So that's part of their minimal viable routine. Something else for me, for example, like walking my dog, feeding my dog, giving him his meds every single day. That's super important. And if I'm hyper focused on a task, God forbid it happens, like I might forget to feed him on time. So automating some of those things. I have automatic feeders. I have a water fountain that's constantly like putting out clean, filtered, cool water for him. I have a dog walker that comes at specific moments in the day where he absolutely needs to go out. So that's no matter what that stasis. And then I can sort of add and supplement that as well. Whatever that looks like for each individual, I would say having a minimal viable routine is pretty crucial. And just making sure that your space at work and at home is supportive of that. So what reminders do you need in your space? The second piece I would say is like energy management. So when I start with any clients, I start to ask them a couple of things. I say, start tracking for the next few weeks. When are you at peak energy? When does your energy kind of slump? And think about the tasks that you dig into. What are the things that came super easily to you? And when were you most energized by those tasks over the next few weeks? Think about the meetings and the work that you're in and just track how you're feeling throughout different parts of the day. And so coming out of that, a really important tool is designing your day around your energy flow. So I have a client who there's a specific type of meeting that she has to have really around the schmoozing and sort of engaging with different types of stakeholders to build relationships. And what we figured out is when her energy is depleting throughout the day, typically happens at a specific point during the week, she tries to move all of those meetings to those times in the week. She's very energized and hyper-focused around 10 a.m. So anything around deep work and deep thinking, we try to carve out space during that period of time for her to do that. So those are some small initial tools that are really helpful. And then the third piece is around somatic awareness. So when we think about when you're feeling regulated and dysregulated, sometimes it's hard to pull yourself off of the dance floor and into the balcony and say, when is that happening? But if you pay attention to what's happening in your body, for example, I know I make my worst decisions when I'm angry, but recognizing what that feels like. I have a tightness in my chest. My palms might start sweating. I might have some frenetic energy that's coming up. My voice might be shaky. Being able to negotiate and understand these like physical things puts you in a position of power because you can recognize when things are coming on and then you can make better decisions around them. So those are like three sorts of small things that I would say to start with that really helps people take control of their environment and harness those strengths.
That I would say for everybody, that's incredibly, critical too. Not even people who are neurodivergent. So I have something what I call a battle rhythm, right? My daily routine, what I got to do. And if there's something off in that routine that doesn't go right, the rest of my day is pretty much blown. And it takes a minute to come back on that. So I'm really glad that you honed in on that about that minimum variable routine. And then also the part that you said it was the somatic resonance.
Somatic awareness.
Yeah, somatic awareness. Can you just touch on that a little bit of like what is that?
Yeah. So soma is your body. It's the sensations you feel in your body. And so I would say for everyone, I think this is really important, even if I work with quote unquote neurotypical clients. But a lot of dysregulation, when we think about a person who's neurodivergent, sometimes one of the things that comes up is different styles of emotional processing. So you might have delayed emotional processing. You might have very heavy handed emotional processing. Your body might shut down. It might avalanche later on. So just being able to understand what's happening in your body at any given moment puts you in greater control of the situations that you're in. So, what does it feel like when you're regulated? Are you breathing easier? What does your posture look like? When are you at ease? How does that feel in your body, in your mind? Cultivating small mindfulness practices as well throughout the day. So, like just a 1 minute meditation, close your eyes and feel the temperature of the air going up into your nose and into your lungs and coming back out helps you identify different sensations that are going on in your body at that time so you can say, what does this feel like? I might be a little bit out of focus right now. I'm having a really hard time concentrating. How is that showing up in my body? Well, my hands are a little bit shaky right now, and I'm easily distracted by everything that's happening around me. Okay, what does that tell me about my state of regulation? Like I have butterfly feelings in my stomach right now. Okay. When else has that cropped up for you in the past? And what did you do to get yourself back to a place of stasis, of equilibrium? And so being able to be in tune with your body naturally helps you be in tune with your emotional states. It allows you to connect to yourself in a different way to sort of understand where you at any given moment and make choices for yourself relative to that moment based on what you need to get done or where you need to be.
That's an awesome definition of what it is. And I think everybody needs to go back and re-listen to everything that you just said. Because I think what a better place the world would be is everyone just kind of got more self-aware about themselves and how they're feeling, and then let that emotional connection take place as well. So that way we can interact better as people. So Rita, is there anything that I didn't ask you or talk about that you're like, you know what? I really have a burning desire to talk about whatever it is.
I think the one thing that I do want to address is I still think, I think in tech, neurodivergence and cognitive diversity is very well represented when we think about different founder types and leaders in tech. It exists. Actually does exist in spades in other industries as well and at other spaces, but there is still very much a stigma associated with this concept of being neurodivergent. And folks get really anxious about self disclosure. Is it okay? Is it not okay? Will people think differently about me? And so I do want to bring that up because you can't address something unless you understand it. And I think we as a community, like more broadly as organizations, we do have a duty to open ourselves up and to hold space and create safety around this concept. Whoever you are, whatever cognitive diversity you bring, we support that. We want you to be successful. We're successful if you're successful. And so if you'd like to engage in a conversation around how you perform best, let's engage in that conversation and extending that well beyond folks who have diagnoses and things like that, and just asking that of all employees and just saying, hey, where do you think best? How does it feel when you're performing your best work? What are the things that are energizing for you and depleting for you? How do you perform best in a meeting? Should we be instituting agendas in certain types of meetings or giving reading materials in advance to help processing? Whatever that looks like, but engaging in practices that reduce the stigma around cognitive diversity, operating from a place of curiosity and creating the safety for people to advocate for themselves and their needs and engage in those thoughtful conversations, I think is really important.
No, absolutely. And you bring up a great point. And as you were talking about that, you reminded me of a coworker that I used to work with very recently. And I noticed that he was struggling a lot, to to really like not necessarily get stuff done, but it's taking a lot of time. And I kept talking to him like, "Hey, is like everything okay? Anything you needed?" And he didn't want to self-disclose certain disabilities that he was having because of the environment. And he was a lawyer and he had pride in himself like, "Hey, I went through law school without any accommodations. I went through X amount of years without any type of accommodations." And I was like, "Yeah, but you're like making life harder on yourself." So I agree with you. I think we need to definitely bring awareness to this and make life better for everybody. How can we make the environment in the workplace more inclusive for everybody so everyone can do their best work? Because, like you said, the whole everything's gonna be better at the end of the day if everyone's at the top of their game. And I really appreciate everything that you brought to the table today, your techniques and everything else that you brought. So, Rita, it was a pleasure meeting you. It was great talking with you. And everyone listening to this, go in the comments. I'll have her contact information and all the stuff there that you can reach out to her. If you're looking for some coaching or you need some tips or something, reach out to her because she's going to have your back. So, Rita, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for such an enjoyable conversation. I really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. Thank you.